Hey, everybody, it's Larry Kotlikoff with Economics Matters, the podcast. I'm delighted to have John Friedman, chair of the Department of Economics at Brown University, with me today to discuss his exciting work and that of his co-authors. John, I knew John as a little guy because I had his dad as a economics professor when I was in grad school years ago, and I'm still in close contact with his dad, the famous distinguished economist Benjamin Friedman, and he also, his mom Barbara Friedman is also, I believe, a PhD economist who's done extensive work in the area of personal finance. Anyway, John is the Brigger Family Distinguished Professor of Economics and International and Public Affairs at Brown University. And he's also the co-director of Opportunity Insights. We'll get you to tell us about that in a bit. His work uses big data to study the causes and consequences of inequality for kids, as well as policies to improve opportunity for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. So this makes his work super relevant. You know, we have the Supreme Court decision about affirmative action, about not universities and colleges not being able to use racial information to let's say to use racial preferences in choosing their class. John's work has appeared in a variety of top academic journals as well as major media outlets. It's been cited by President Obama in his 2012 State of the Union address. It's shaped policies at the federal, state, and local level. He's really had a big influence, he and his co-authors, on what's going on in terms of policy. And I'm sure my brother, who's the provost at Cornell, said, "Did you read John Friedman's recent paper with this guy named Chetty from Harvard?" I guess you may have some other co-authors on that. I said, "I haven't read that one yet. I'm going to take a look." So everybody's talking about your work. Most recently, John and his colleagues at Opportunity Insights have studied the barriers to equal opportunity to highly selective colleges like Harvard and Brown, showing not only how these schools could do more to promote upward mobility through changes to their admissions policies, but also the great potential from doing so. He's worked as a special assistant to the President for Economic Policy at the National Economic Council at the White House. He's also a research associate at the NBER, National Bureau of Economic Research, co-editor at the flagship journal in the profession. That's the top journal in the profession, some would say, the American Economic Review. Others would say it's Journal of Political Economy or Econometrica or Review of Economic Studies or whatever. Anyway, again, he's currently the chair at the Brown University. So John received his BA in economics at a place called Harvard. Then he received his another degree at Harvard at the same time, a joint degree in statistics. So an AM as opposed to an AB, I guess, as opposed to a BA. Anyway, he graduated with a joint degree from Harvard College and Harvard University in economics and statistics. He was summa cum laude. And then he went on to get a PhD at Harvard, and he graduated in 2017. So, John, welcome. It's great to have you. Thank you so much for joining us to talk about these important issues. You just published a paper. Let me talk to you about the paper that my brother called me about. It's called Diversifying Americans' Leaders. It's with Raj Chetty, who's at Harvard, and David Deming. I'm not sure where David's at. Where's David
at the Kennedy School.
Kennedy School. So, and John. So the three of you guys wrote this paper called "Diversifying America's Leaders: The Determinants and Causal Effects of Admissions at Highly Selective Private Colleges," and you find that if you look at the top CEOs, major companies around the country, the Supreme Court justices, and other top professions that you find a lot of people from schools that one would view as elite, from Harvard, MIT, Chicago, Yale, Stanford, places like this. There's a disproportionate number. And talk to us about this study and why it's so surprising, and what it reflects. What do you think it's coming from?
Sure. So, I think the starting point is exactly the set of statistics that you mentioned, right? If you look around at where people in positions of leadership, whether that be in the business world, the political world, and other spheres have come from, the share that come from these very elite universities is extraordinarily high. But if you look at what types of students actually attend these universities, you see that even compared to other students that have the same test scores, students from high-income families are substantially more likely to attend. And so what this paper is trying to do is put those facts together and ask, if these schools are really providing this pathway towards leadership, is it doing so for an artificially narrow group of people, or flipped around, maybe even more positively, could it offer a broader group of students access to this really outstanding path? And if so, what would it need to do that? What are the barriers that are getting in the way, and what would be the policies that it would affect them?
So you're if I come to Harvard and I have let's say an elite background, first of all, I have somehow a disproportionate chance of getting in, right? Even if that was one of the things that struck my brother, since he's involved in kind of overseeing admissions at Cornell. This is my twin brother. He's 5 minutes older, so I have to look up to him. But
yeah, so there are really two different parts of the paper. The first part of the paper is focused on access to these institutions, right? It's a fact that we start with that students from higher income families are much more likely to attend, even relative to students with the same test scores from low and especially middle income families. But the way that one would look at those disparities and the policies that one would then want to pursue to close them is going to depend a lot on what's going on. And so many scholars have thought about this question, and people have identified, I think, financial aid as one potential driver, right? Maybe students are getting in and they just can't accept the offer because it's not, it's too expensive for them and their families. Or maybe that fear of the lack of financial aid, or the lack of information, or the lack of being welcoming, or something like that, is reducing the number of applications that these schools are getting from diverse students to begin with. So most of the literature has been focused on decisions that the students are making. The students might decide to apply to these schools like Cornell or not. They will decide to attend Cornell once they get an offer of admissions or not. And of course, the colleges can try to indirectly affect those policies by changing financial aid or doing outreach or other things like that. What we found to be a little bit odd is that there's that point in the middle where colleges are choosing which students to accept. And when we do the analysis, that part, the part of the process that's really solely in the control of the universities, is by far the largest component of explaining why these students from very high-income families are much more likely to be attending these elite schools than students from low and middle-income families. About 2/3 of the gap is caused just by admissions policies.
So this means that the admissions officer is impressed by, this reflects interviews that the admissions officer would be having with kids in part. And so the admissions, could one say, the admission officer hears that the kid's father, grandfather, and great-grandfather all went to Harvard, and bingo, the kid is admitted, even though that kid's no better than this other kid who doesn't have that kind of background heritage, let's say.
Yeah, so we think that most of the preference for high-income kids are coming indirectly by attributes that high-income students are much more likely to have, rather than a direct preference for just having kids from wealthy families. One of them, which you mentioned, is the preference for students who are legacies. Right, most of these elite colleges have these preferences where children of alumni receive some sort of boost in the admissions process. The colleges will often talk about it as a feather on the scale, or something that implies that it's really just on the margin. But what we show in these data are that students who are legacies on average receive about a 3 or 4 times higher admissions chance than other students that look the same, just aren't legacy students, have the same academic credentials, the same set of non-academic extracurricular profiles and such. And so there's really a very large boost that's being given to these students. It's probably larger than the boost being given to students from underrepresented minority groups under the affirmative action regime and admissions. We can talk about that. The Supreme Court has just ended. Of course, it's no surprise that students from high-income families are more likely to be the ones who are legacy students to benefit from this. It turns out that the legacy boost itself is actually larger for students from high-income families. Might be as large as 5 times higher admissions rates for students from high-income families, compared with more like 3 times for students from low and middle-income families. So that's one of the components. The other components, which we can talk about more in detail if you want, it turns out that almost all of these schools have athletic programs where there are special recruiting procedures and kind of spots in the class that are allocated to them. It turns out that recruited athletes at these schools disproportionately come from high-income families. And then the final thing is that it turns out these schools' admissions officers' evaluation of these non-academic characteristics like extracurriculars or your personality or that type of thing, that's also kind of quite biased in favor of students from high-income families. We think because of the schools the students attend. High-income students are much more likely to attend private high schools or other really well-resourced schools in a way where there's more attention to the college counseling process. Probably the letter of recommendations are better, the guidance counselor letters are better, kind of all that combines to be the third factor that in our data account for this higher admissions rate for students from high-income families.
Do these kids usually have an interview with the admissions officer, or is it usually chosen to decide without it?
I don't think any of these schools have interviews with admissions officers. These are just the process of admitting and considering all these applications is just way too large to have admissions officers involved. Some of these schools have alumni interviews. Some of them do, some of them don't. Some of them have had them in the past and dropped them during the pandemic. That differs quite a bit across places. We found, though, that the alumni interviews, they don't really seem to play a huge role in the decision process itself. And so my sense is you want to think about that a little bit more as something to engage the alumni rather than really a critical part of the evaluation of the students who are applicants.
I see. So somewhere in this whole application process, I get to write that all my relatives from Jamestown or Plymouth Rock went to Harvard, and so I get across the idea that I'm a legacy student. I guess I can't.
Most schools explicitly ask for the education of your parents, and then sometimes there's a box you can check to identify if any of your relatives attended the school in question. And some, it happens differently, different schools, but some schools really focus only on if your parents went there. Some schools pay attention to whether your grandparents went there or your siblings went there. There's kind of different versions.
So let's say you're running Harvard right now. Harvard's under a lot of scrutiny on all kinds of issues. But would you drop this question about whether your parents or grandparents, whatever, went to Harvard? And would you tell people in their letters explicitly, don't tell us about your where your parents went to school. Tell us if they did go to college, but don't tell us where they went to college, because we won't regard it, and it will, let's say, reduce your, just at least say we will not take it into account. So please don't tell us. They could do that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the controlling the information is hard because it slips in there one way or another. But many of these schools have explicit admissions priorities where favoring legacy students is just on the list. And so correspondingly, I think it's within the policy levers that all these schools have to just take legacy off the list. I think the reason why legacy students are favored in the admissions process, it's not that the admissions officers themselves have some secret affinity for legacy students. It's that it is official university policy to favor these students, and they're implementing the policies that they're given. But picking the broader question that you asked, yeah, I think that I just think I think it's not something the university should be doing from the perspective of what they owe to society. I think there's a lot of inequality in the world. These universities aren't going to fix it themselves, but I think they should be tilting against the unequal playing field. And many of them, most of them, profess that this is what they want to do. And so I think it's not that we're asking them to have an impact in the world that they don't already claim they want to have. And I think this is a pretty glaring example of something that it's pretty hard to justify from first principles. And I think part of the reason this is receiving a lot more attention in the wake of the Supreme Court decision is that however hard it might have been to maintain the support for legacy preferences when one is also then having preferences for students from underrepresented racial and ethnic backgrounds, I think it's even harder to say, well, we're going to get rid of the latter, but we're gonna still keep favoring students who are children of alums. I think there are a lot of really bright kids out in the world. I don't think they'll have any trouble filling their classes. I think that alums might get upset, but especially if it's something where lots of schools are getting rid of this because that's the way the world is going. My instinct is that it's not going to have a huge impact on the financial bottom line of these schools. And so, yeah, I think that they would not only be in a better place politically, but they would be able to, make meaningfully larger contributions to upward mobility in society if they got rid of these policies.
Have you seen any universities, any major lead places that adopt this new policy of not asking about legacy information?
Well, so there have been a number of schools that have made that change. So Johns Hopkins went to remove legacies in, I believe, 2016. More recently, Wesleyan University announced just after the Supreme Court decision that they were getting rid of legacy. I believe Amherst College did so about a year ago. But it's still really more the exception than the norm. Most schools still have these policies. All schools, I think, are evaluating whether to keep them. And my sense of what's going on is that it's understandably maybe politically challenging for a president to be the first of these elite schools to get rid of it. Because now all your alums feel like they're having something taken away, and all their buddies that went to all the other schools still have that advantage for their kids, right? Why are we the ones who are suffering? I still think it would be a good thing to do, but I understand the political dynamics. At the same time, I think that no one really wants to be the last school hanging on to this. I think once the ball starts rolling down the hill here, I think people are going to want to kind of get out of the way. And so, I don't quite know what it'll take to get the ball started, but my instinct is that one way or another, this is all going to be gone in the next number of years. And I think we're going to look back
if that happened
now and kind of be shocked that this was something that these schools once did.
Well, I think that you're right, that this will happen, and that society will be a lot better off because of the work of three economists, which is pretty important. Just to change anything is very difficult, but change something that's important.
Well,
now, let me ask you.
I was just saying, one other thing I think that's important to think about is that legacy preferences are one very discrete version of ways that universities indirectly favor students from high-income families. But things like athletics and these non-academic aspects of applications, I don't think it's super obvious that anyone engaged in athletic recruiting knows that they're favoring students from high-income families, right? It's something that's really indirect. I think it's something that comes about from the set of sports that these schools support and the training that is required to go into it. But I think the broader point to take away is you can't just try to get rid of the really explicit stuff. I think you have to come at the problem from a broader perspective and really commit more broadly to trying to have a diverse group of students socioeconomically. And so I think if schools just try to get rid of legacy preferences and then don't embed that in some broader set of policy reforms, it's very possible that we'll just end up replacing one group of predominantly wealthy students with another group of predominantly wealthy students, and it won't really have the sort of effect that one would hope. And so, I would really encourage schools to think about this more broadly than just thinking about that one narrow policy, even though it's gotten a lot of attention.
A quick question here, which is, legacy and income are not necessarily, perfectly correlated. So
that's right.
You're finding a separate impact of legacy from high income. They're both impacting the probability of getting in disproportionately.
So the way to think about it is that we start with a measure of these admissions rates for students from different family income backgrounds, but with the same test score. So high income students are getting in at about 2.5 times higher rate than students from middle income families. We then ask what, other than test score, because we've already accounted for that, what else could explain those differences? And legacy preferences explain about 40% of those differences, something like that. And so it's part of the explanation of the higher admissions rates for high income students. Now, you're absolutely right. There are students who are legacy students from not super high income families. As I mentioned before, they do receive the legacy benefit, albeit a little bit smaller of a legacy benefit than the legacies from very high income families. But that's part of why it's possible, if you get rid of legacy preferences, that if intuitively it opens up a bunch of spots in the class, maybe 100 slots or something like that at an average one of these schools. But then who fills those seats depends on, that's a policy choice too. We model it as if you just continue doing whatever else you're doing. But, I think one probably wants to think a little bit more intentionally about what you're going to do with those slots that have been freed up.
So let me turn you to another question, which is, so you look at the Supreme Court, and one of the things you say in your paper is that a disproportionate number coming from the top Ivy League schools, or maybe Stanford as well, and MIT and Chicago. What do you make of that? What is going on there? That's clearly you've got a bigger group of. So that's, you're saying that this is somehow the same force is kind of, the same processes at work here with respect to admissions as with respect to being admitted to the Supreme Court. That there's something that people are giving over too much weight, or they're overweighting people's having been to Harvard. Let's put it that way.
I'm not
want to have a Supreme Court that's full of people from Harvard. Somehow that's going to send a message.
Yeah. So we don't really have anything to say about the process of getting onto the Supreme Court itself. or, I mean, obviously we have literally nothing to say about the Supreme Court because, that's not so many people and there's not enough data. But what we do is so the first half of the paper is really about the admissions process. The second half of the paper is really about the causal effect of attending these schools. And, just to emphasize how important that is, right? If the mere fact that many leaders in society come from these schools doesn't imply that these schools have a large causal effect, right? Because these are a very highly selected group of students. Even with all these kind of peccadillos in the admissions process, they're a really very impressive group of students. There's not a single student who gets admitted to these schools that's not incredibly impressive on at least some dimension. And so I think it's entirely possible that the fact that so many, say, CEOs come from these Ivy Plus institutions just reflects the fact that there's a really great set of students that are being admitted. And in fact, some of the prominent work previously to look at this question, quite famous paper by Stacey Dale and Alan Kruger, found that there was really no, if any, causal effect for attending these schools. So we look at this question and we find that there's really a very substantial causal effect of attending these schools in the sense that a student that attends, let's say, Harvard, is going to have a much larger set of job market opportunities, especially at the very elite end of the labor force, than if that same student had attended one of the very best public institutions in the country, like a Michigan or a Berkeley or UCLA or UT Austin, someplace like that. So this is not about going to college versus not going to college. This is about the additional benefit that a student gets from attending one of these very most selective Ivy Plus institutions. What we find is that the effects are especially concentrated in these kind of top-end leadership roles. It's not that much more likely that you have a good, solid paying job, but it is much more likely that you're earning millions of dollars in the top 1% of the distribution of other kids your age. It's much more likely that you attend an elite graduate school. It's almost twice as likely if a causal effect of attending these schools. You're 3 times more likely to have a job at a prestigious firm, which is our attempt to capture in a broad way the fact that one can be successful in business and make a lot of money. You can also be successful in research or education in a way that you're kind of equally at the top of the distribution from a social perspective. Maybe you're just not earning as much money. And so it really does seem like attending these schools gives these students a tremendous advantage. Now, one concern that, of course, one might have is if the only students who are getting this benefit are the students from the high-income families, then just admitting more students from a broader representation of families, maybe that wouldn't put more kids from the middle class and from lower income families on this very steep career trajectory. But we don't really find any evidence of that. It seems like pretty much all the students who attend these schools benefit tremendously from doing so.
So getting into Harvard is the ticket, no matter whether you're rich or poor or middle class. But
that's a great way to phrase it. That's
why are your results so different from Kruger and Dahl, right?
Yeah. So it's really 2 different things. So one is that we're a bit more focused on the top tail outcomes. They're just using log wages as a measure. And so you particularly see the effects if you really focus on the top end of the income distribution. The other reason that we find effects and they don't is that they are somewhat, they're actually not directly estimating the causal effect of getting into, say, Harvard versus Berkeley. What they're doing is they're estimating the effect of getting into a school that has a higher average SAT or ACT score. And at this level, it turns out that there are huge differences across schools in whether they make you earn a lot of money or not, in a way that doesn't really correlate that much with what your average SAT scores are. So for instance, like Brown is a school that's, we see this in the data, but, even stereotypically is, a lot more focused on students having social impact or going into arts in a way that average salaries for brown graduates are quite a bit lower than average salaries for students at the University of Pennsylvania. Now, I think our average test scores are pretty similar to Penn's, but the fact that Dale and Kruger aren't looking at those types of differences, they're only asking whether SAT scores at the school level are a predictor of the causal effect, means that they're not quite, it's just not the right variable to use to classify the schools.
Right. So they're saying, look, it really doesn't matter. Leaving aside going to elite school, doesn't matter where you go, given your SAT, you're going to do equally well. But then you're saying, well, let's ask whether, given your SAT, if you go to one of these elite top schools,
that's
like,
right,
or Dartmouth, whatever, whether it does matter. You're saying it matters in spades, and that
that's right.
So therefore, we've kind of been people, even myself, and things I've written, have kind of overstated their finding over the years. Okay, so we talked about that paper, and it's likely, the remediation and its likely impact, which I think will happen over time. Let's talk about the Supreme Court's decision, which prohibits the use of race in admissions decisions, although it doesn't prohibit people from saying, hey, I had, here's my background, including, I grew up in a Black family or a Native American family, whatever my background is. So you can certainly say that in your letter. And for admissions officers who are trying to make a diverse class, there's nothing wrong to take into account that information, as far as I understand. But first of all, do you see the Supreme Court decision as dramatically changing the composition of classes, or do you think it's going to be somehow the same no matter this decision?
So, we're going to see pretty soon. All these colleges admitted their students in the last couple of weeks, and statistics will be released at some point over the summer, where we'll start to see what effects this decision has had. So it's too early to really know from the data. But yeah, I would say both that we will see notably less diverse classes along racial lines at the affected schools, while at the same time, I think that the changes are going to be less profound than some of the schools might have feared, or might have led people to believe as part of the court process. And I think part of that is exactly because of what you said. The Supreme Court ruled out the use of kind of what they called race qua race. So you're not allowed to have a higher admissions rate simply because somebody checked the box to say that they were Black or Hispanic or American Indian, Native Alaskan, or Pacific Islander on the admissions form. But you are allowed to take into account individual circumstances, which might include the fact that someone has been growing up in a neighborhood that's highly racially segregated, and their experience of racism. I think sometimes people think about these changes as affecting the information that's available to admissions officers. Like, admissions officers used to be able to see that you checked the box to say you were white or Black or Hispanic, and now they just don't have that information. I think that's the wrong way to look at it. I think that in most of these cases, the race of the applicant is pretty clear. That could be from what they write about in their essay. That could be simply from the name that they have, or the high school that they went to, or the neighborhood that they grew up in. It's really about the decisions that are made based on that information. And I think we're going to see, again, a meaningful change in what those decisions look like in a way that's going to affect these classes. But I don't think we're going to, just to give you some numbers, I think in the Harvard case, Harvard was about 14 or 15% of their students were Black. Some of the modeling would suggest that removing the race-specific preference would drop that number down to like 6%. So, a fall of maybe 2/3, 60%. I don't think we're going to fall that far. I would guess we're going to end up in like the 11, 12, 10% range. So it's going to be a really big difference, but not quite the stark change that some people predicted. We're also going to see huge differences across schools, right? Schools are going to try to implement this in different ways. And inevitably, some school is going to be really aggressive about it. Some school is not going to have any change in the fraction of Black applicant or Black students that might even go up. And then, these groups are going to sue that school. And the next legal battle around this is going to be, what did the Supreme Court mean when they said they could take into account a student's individual courage and determination? And what guardrails can then be put around the use of that with respect to race and admissions?
Yeah, it sounds like a real hornet's nest here. It seems like, if they keep getting sued, they're going to have to drop any information that's could reveal somebody's background and just go on.
But that's impossible. I think that's, again, if Jamal Jackson has grown up in a neighborhood that's 90% Black and attended a school that's 95% minority students, it's impossible to hide that information. That, the part of the reason I think why this is so difficult is that it's not just about preferring one student over another because of the color of his or her skin. It's about how a lot of these racial disparities are really deeply embedded in the neighborhoods kids grow up in and the environments that they're around and the school quality that they exist on the way up. It's just, you cannot disentangle this stuff in such a neat way.
Unless you just said, we're going to randomly accept people, period. Whoever applies is just going to, choose from a bucket, choose the balls, and Jamal would be chosen in proportion to his representation in society.
Yeah, I think
that's going to undermine higher education pretty dramatically because.
Yeah, look, all of these schools are trying to trade off some assessment of academic preparation on the student's part with a variety of other desires for their student body, some of which are about racial and ethnic diversity, but some are just about, who's playing a musical instrument and who's on the track team and who's on the newspaper and who's engaged in different ways, who's studying different subjects. And so, a system where you just randomly chose would have to give up on both of those things, right? You both would no longer be able to help, shape a class to have mixes of people, and nor would you be able to have anything to say about academic preparation, which I think is really key to how many of these schools distinguish the undergraduate experience from one another. I would have thought that, I have no hard data on this, but one of the reasons why these Ivy Plus schools that we studied have such large positive effects on students' trajectories is exactly that they are pulling together a ton of unbelievably talented people, and that creates educational opportunities both inside the classroom and beyond that I think probably have huge effects on their outcomes. I should say, by the way, it's not only that these Ivy Plus schools have huge effects, right? Going to UC Berkeley is going to give you a much greater shot at these opportunities than going to UC Davis, which itself will give you a better opportunity than going to Cal State, East Bay. All of these things, I think, college quality matters, I think, in part because of investments in teaching and resources, but in part because of who the students are that you're in school with.
So, John, if you had been on the Supreme Court, you had enough Harvard, diplomas to merit being appointed to the Supreme Court. Apparently, given the way people are chosen, how would you have voted in that decision? Did you think it was a bad decision?
So I'm not a lawyer, and so I don't have anything to say about exactly the legal basis for it. Does the 14th Amendment support this or not? I don't have the expertise to say that. What I do think, just coming back to the place where I always try to start on these issues, which is, I think, one of the not just main purposes, but responsibilities of these institutions of higher education is to support upward mobility in society. And part of that involves kind of tilting against these inequalities of opportunity that exist. Right, the data are very clear that children, purely by the circumstances of their birth, have very, very different opportunities to succeed in life. And I think it's really very difficult to justify those. I think having more equality of opportunity would not just be the right thing to do from a social, ethical, and moral perspective, but it would probably lead to faster growth and giving more people the opportunity to contribute in whatever way they can would be important. And then, coming from that principle starting point, it's very clear that one of the dimensions, it's not the only dimension, but one of the very important dimensions upon which opportunity varies for children in the United States is based on race. Children who are Black, growing up in a family with the same income on the same block as a white child is statistically going to be much less likely to earn any given amount of money or higher when they grow up. They're going to be much more likely to end up in prison when they grow up. And so I think, in the presence of these disparities, I think it makes sense to allow colleges the opportunities, just as I hope they do for income and other sources of disparities as well. I think they should be able to help to counterbalance that. And because these statistical relationships are so strong, I don't think that it needs to load quite so much on the individual, pleading for, help of a student in an essay as the decision would make it sound. Just to offer a statistic, support this, take the Black children of millionaires, right? There aren't that many of them, but there are Black children who grow up as the children of millionaires. Those children are about as likely to end up in prison as a white child who's growing up in a family earning about $50,000 a year. And so even though by many measures, the Black child of a millionaire is a very privileged person in society, that person is still facing serious barriers to opportunity that his or her white counterparts don't. And I think if we're going to we have to respect academic preparation and all the other stuff as well. We shouldn't be making decisions only based on this, but I think limiting universities' ability to take race into account, I think it makes it much harder for them to tilt against inequality of opportunity in society, as at least I would like to see them do.
Let me ask you, in our remaining few minutes here, let's suppose you were the dictator for a day, or maybe a month, or maybe a year of education. You could pass any bill, you could change anything you'd like. We know kind of what you probably would reverse overnight if you could, as being dictator, this Supreme Court decision. You would probably, get rid of legacy as as a criteria for admissions administrators to take into account. You would do a bunch of things in the college, university sphere, but what would you do with respect to early education and elementary school education? We know from work that you and others, Jim Heckman in particular, have done, and I'm not an expert in this area, but my general sense is that early education is extremely important, and that the U.S. is way down the list of countries in terms of providing early education. So anyway, your education czar, and I really mean czar, for a year, what would you do? Unless you could do it permanently, you can make permanent changes.
Yeah, so I agree with you. I think, even just to put into context how important this is, students from high-income families are about 20 times more likely to go to Ivy Plus institutions than students from kind of middle-income families. That's just like who shows up at school, no adjustment for anything. Once you compare students with the same test score, that drops to about 2.5 times. And so if we think about the whole societal difference, right, 20 times, 2.5 times is coming from let's label as like academic preparation differences, or sorry, differences in pretty much admissions rates, conditional on academic preparation when you're graduating from high school. The other 8 times are coming from differences in academic preparation at the end of high school. And so the fact that we focused on this 2.5 times, it's not a statement about it being more important than the other part. If anything, I think the other part's clearly more important. It's just that this disparity can be fixed by literally 12 people, the presidents of the 12 Ivy Plus universities, changing policy in a way that fixing all the inequalities in school and neighborhoods and so many other things that affect children as they are growing up. That's a much, much bigger problem. But I do think that education is the best policy tool for doing that. I agree with Jim Heckman and many others that early education is incredibly important. I would add, I think the data don't really suggest that early education is more important. I think early education is very important. I think middle school education is very important. I think high school education is very important. College education is very important. I think education is just very important all along the way. So what would I do? I think the largest barrier at this point is just funding. Money doesn't automatically make schools better, but we have at this point many, many different ways that researchers have found that investments in one way or another really do seriously improve the quality of education, not only is judged by test scores at the moment, but is judged by long-term outcomes. So there's good data that having smaller class sizes can improve the quality of education and increase long-term outcomes. Having better teachers can improve the quality of education and long-term outcomes. Having a more robust peer tutoring system can improve the quality of education and long-term outcomes. Having more robust after-school programs and summer support so that there's not as much loss. The list can go on and on. And so sometimes I think we get a little bit too caught up arguing about whether this exact educational intervention or that exact educational intervention is exactly the right one to do. And we lose that broader perspective that whether we do, intervention A or A star or A star star, all of them have the potential to really quite seriously improve children's trajectories. And so, we did this actually once recently in the past couple of years. We invested about $300 billion in education in an attempt to make up for some of the widening of disparities and the access to quality education that came about because of the pandemic. But the increase in disparities because of the pandemic, right, as bad as that was, the right way to think about it is that made things like 10 or 20% worse than they already were. So, if people are really concerned about what the pandemic did, you should be incredibly concerned about the disparities that existed before the pandemic. And so, what I would like to see is to take that $300 billion of investment, and rather than think of it as a one-off thing, I think that should be a more recurring, a much more recurring feature. And, we need to govern it and make sure that, districts are spending it in appropriate ways. But, I think that there are just so many ways that we already know about to improve the quality of education. It's much more about an implementation issue than it is about coming up with ideas in the first place.
So are you saying that we're spending a lot less per student in low income areas than was the case in relative to GDP per capita? I mean, let me ask you this: is there a big funding? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, it is both true that we spend less on students from low-income families than we do for students from high-income families, but that makes it sound like having equal amounts of funding is the right level of funding. And I would have said, again, if the point of education is to try to help create equality of opportunity, then a child that's born into a difficult circumstance through no fault of their own, they should receive more investment from public education than someone who's not. I think that it's really hard to find somebody who would be kind of affirmatively in favor of these large disparities that exist for children, right? It's not their fault. You can't control where you're born, And I would like to do more to counteract that rather than just merely seek equality, which again, we do not have that, but I'm not sure that's the right benchmark either.
Okay. So, one of my favorite ideas here is just having the Department of Education. This is like almost costless. Just tape the 5 best teachers of high school, let's say 8th grade algebra, and put those classes online for anybody to use in teaching, and make that true for every course that we give in K through 12, and have kids be able to on weekends or at night or with their parents or on their own, or maybe in the classroom with a headset so they're not being disrupted by other kids, be able to get some uniform education, because this is educational equality. You get the best people teaching everybody in the country, no matter what the property tax situation is in their locality. That seems to me to be like a no-brainer. Cuba, from what I understand, my wife and I visited Cuba a couple of years ago. The kids there across the country watch TV a couple hours a day. Obviously, Cuba's screwed up in a zillion different ways, and they've got a terrible economy, and it's an autocracy, whatever, dictatorship. But when it comes to education, I think the Cubans are pretty well educated, from what I gather. And it may just be because, and it seems to be uniform, and it may just be putting these kids in front of the TV with the best teacher in the country, teaching them calculus or whatever course it might be. Maybe it's Latin, whatever. Anyway, so I think there are things that can be done on the cheap, as well as adding money, but we need to be changing policy. I think if I were president, I would make you Secretary of Education overnight, and I don't know if you take the job, but we could use you in that position.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a neat idea, and certainly I think that technology, whether it be individual specific, adjusting the level of instruction for where a given student is, or the ability to have videos or Zooms in a way that allow students access to a broader set of resources. I think a lot of people thinking creatively about how to do that. I guess one thing I do think we learned during the pandemic is the importance of in-person schooling. If you have the view that all you need is access to a computer and somebody doing something in a high quality way on Zoom, then I think the effects of the pandemic on education would have been a lot less than they were. And so I think of a really good in-person environment is it's a complement to, not a substitute for, those types of ideas. Another thing that we saw during the pandemic, which I think maybe has broader lessons for, how to think about education, the schools that responded best to the pandemic, the schools that maintained learning best when everyone had to go home in spring 2020, they tended to be schools that thought of their mission in education a bit more broadly than teaching students from 8 in the morning till 3 o'clock in the afternoon while they were in school. Some schools take a much more expansive view, and they say, look, it's our responsibility to deliver a high quality program, when you're sitting in school learning. But if you are having huge problems at home in a way that prevent you from having a space to study or having the mindset to be able to learn when you come to school, they can't solve all those problems, but that's something that they're going to be concerned about. And those schools, I think, performed better during the pandemic, because even though the pandemic was a generational disruption to education, it was actually just a much larger version of something that these schools had actually had a great deal of experience with, where a student might lose a parent to go be incarcerated, or there might be some disruption at home that prevents them from being able to really learn. They were used to providing this broader set of supports to students. They were used to having students come in to have breakfast in school because that was the only way they were going to get a nutritional meal to give them the energy they needed to study for the rest of the day, stuff like that. And so for those schools, thinking about how to get a laptop out to a student and how to get them internet access, that was just, it was a little bit different, but part of the type of thing they'd already been doing in a way that for schools that thought of their mission much more narrowly, they thought, oh my God, how are we supposed to do this? That's not our job. And those were the schools that not only saw the educational quality drop the most, in many of these schools, they just gave up and there was just nothing for months at a time. And so I think having schools take a little bit more of that holistic view of education, I think would be a good thing.
Okay, Mr. Future Secretary of Education, it's been delightful hour talking with you about this, and keep up the great research. I recommend everybody take a look at John's papers, recent and past. There's a wealth of information there on many, many different topics beyond education. So thank you so much, John Friedman.
All right. Thanks so much for having me on, Larry. Always a pleasure to talk with you.
Great. Talk to you soon.